My name is Darren, and I work as a maintenance supervisor for the MTA in New York City. It's a good job, steady, pays well, and keeps me underground most of the day, which I honestly don't mind. I was never one for office politics or small talk, so working in the tunnels suits me. I've been in it for 15 years now, and I thought I'd seen it all. Rats the size of small dogs, entire encampments hidden beyond maintenance hatches, graffiti so elaborate it looked like it belonged in a museum. But I was wrong. So wrong. There are things in those tunnels that shouldn't be there. Things that don't make sense. And it all started 3 weeks ago. I was on the overnight shift, doing a routine inspection near the abandoned City Hall station. If you've never heard of it, it's this old, ornate subway stop that was decommissioned decades ago, but it still sits under Manhattan, collecting dust and echoes. Tourists sometimes sneak in for photos, and every now and then, some drunk college kids will wander too far down the track. But that night, it was just me and my flashlight, checking for structural damage. The air was thick with the scent of rust and stagnant water, and the hum of distant trains rattled through the tunnels like whispers. That's why I saw the footprints. Now, you have to understand, nobody should have been down there. The ground was coated in years of dust and grime, but there they were, fresh footprints leading from the tracks into a service tunnel that hadn't been used in decades. Bare footprints. Human, but elongated, the toes just a little too long, pressing deep into the dirt as if whoever left them had been walking on tiptoes. I stood there for a long moment, just staring. The tunnel they led into was supposed to be sealed off. It had collapsed years ago, and the city never bothered to clear it out. But as I swung my flashlight toward the entrance, I saw something that made my stomach drop. The old metal gate that had once blocked it was gone. Not broken, not rusted away. Just gone, as if it had never been there. I should have called it in. Should have turned around and radioed dispatch. But I didn't. Instead, I followed the footprints. The deeper I went, the worse it got. The walls were lined with rusted pipes and old maintenance lockers, some still bolted shut, others hanging open like yawning mouths. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and something else, something coppery and sweet. My flashlight flickered, the battery drained faster than it should have, and for a second, I thought I heard breathing. Not mine. Slow, wet, and uneven, like someone struggling to inhale through broken lungs. I turned a corner, and that's when I saw it. A shape, hunched and shivering in the shadows. Pale, almost translucent skin stretched too tight over a body that was all wrong, limbs too long, spine arched at an impossible angle. It wasn't facing me, but I could see its ribs moving with every shuddering breath. It was barefoot. And then, slowly, as if it had been waiting for me, it turned its head. Not its body. Just its head. The eyes, God, the eyes. They were wrong. Too large, too dark, like two holes punched into its face. It opened its mouth, but no sound came out. Just a wet, gurgling noise, like something trying to scream with no air left in its lungs. I ran. I don't remember getting back to the main track. 1 second I was frozen in place, the next I was sprinting, lungs burning, heart slamming against my ribs. When I finally reached the platform, I collapsed against the wall, gasping. The tunnel behind me was empty. Silent. Whatever I had seen, whatever had seen me, it was gone. I didn't tell anyone. Not at first. I convinced myself I was just tired, maybe a little dehydrated. But then, the next night, I went back. And the footprints were still there. But this time, they were facing the other direction. Like something had followed me back. I didn't sleep that morning. I went straight home, locked my door, and sat on the couch with the TV playing static in the background, volume low, just enough noise to keep the silence from swallowing me. I kept seeing that thing in my head, its shape, the way its head turned too smoothly, the empty black pits where its eyes should have been. And the footprints. I couldn't stop thinking about those, the way they had been facing the other way, like something had followed me back. I told myself I wouldn't return, that I'd report it as a possible break-in, let someone else deal with it. But the thought sat in my skull like a stone, pressing heavier with every passing hour. I needed to know if it was still there. By the time my shift rolled around, I had almost convinced myself I had imagined it. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe the underground plays tricks on you, the shadows, the distant echoes, the way your own breath sometimes feels like it's coming from somewhere else. I strapped on my tool belt, clipped my flashlight to my vest, and told myself I'd just take a quick look, just long enough to prove to myself that I had been seeing things. And this time, I brought a crowbar. City Hall Station was just as empty as before, the air thick with the familiar scent of rust and stagnant water. I moved quickly, keeping my breath steady as I reached the entrance to the abandoned service tunnel. My flashlight cut through the dark, and I felt my stomach tighten. The footprints were still there. Only now, there were more of them. They branched off in different directions, circling back over themselves like something had been pacing, restless, waiting. And then, deeper in the tunnel, they just stopped. No fading, no drag marks. Just an abrupt end, like whatever made them had simply ceased to exist. I took a step forward, and my flashlight flickered. Another step, another flicker. Somewhere ahead, beyond the edge of my light, something moved. It wasn't a rat. It wasn't the wind. It was big. My fingers tightened around the crowbar, the weight of it solid and reassuring in my grip. "Hello?" My own voice sounded strange, swallowed up by the emptiness. The air smelled worse now, thicker, rancid, like something long dead left to rot in standing water. My foot hit something solid, and I nearly tripped. The old metal gate. The one that had been missing the night before. It lay twisted on the ground, torn from its hinges like it had been wrenched free by something impossibly strong. And beyond it, where I knew for a fact there had never been anything but a wall of stone and steel, stood a door. It was old, older than the rest of the tunnel, older than the station itself. Rusted metal, stained and pitted, its surface marred with deep scratches that looked too precise to be from time alone. It was barely open, just enough to reveal a sliver of absolute darkness beyond. No maps showed it, no blueprints marked it. I had walked this tunnel for years and never seen it before. A deep, sour stench leaked from inside, an overwhelming mix of decay and something chemical, acrid and sharp enough to sting the back of my throat. My flashlight's beam barely penetrated the gap, the darkness beyond seeming to absorb it like a mouth-swallowing light hole. And then, in that perfect, awful silence, I heard it. Breathing. Not from inside the door. From behind me. I spun, crowbar raised, the air suddenly cold against the sweat on my skin. The tunnel was empty. The footprints gone. Not smeared, not erased, just gone, like they had never been there at all. The hairs on my arms stood on end as the door behind me shifted, the rusted hinges groaning as it creaked open another inch. The sound scraped against my skull like something alive, sharp and deliberate. I ran. I don't remember making it back to the main tunnel. One moment I was frozen, heart hammering, and the next I was sprinting past the old station, through the dim emergency lights, not stopping until I reached the nearest manned platform. A few passengers waiting for the late train turned to stare as I stumbled out of the access tunnel, breath ragged, sweat dripping down my face, but I didn't care. I clocked out early, told my supervisor I was sick, and left without looking back. He barely glanced up from his desk, just waved me off like it was nothing. By the time I got home, I had a plan. I was going to report it, tell them there was an unauthorized entry in an old maintenance tunnel, make it someone else's problem. I grabbed my phone, ready to call it in. Then I saw the notification. An audio file. No number. No sender. Just sitting there in my messages. My hand shook as I tapped it, press play. Silence. Then, breathing. Slow. Wet. And underneath it, so faint I almost didn't catch it, something whistling. A tune I had never heard before. But somehow, I knew it was meant for me. The silence in my apartment felt unnatural, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I had locked the door. Checked the windows. But none of it made me feel safer. The audio file sat in my phone like a weight, untouched since I first listened. The slow, wet breathing. The whistling. I played it once more, this time forcing myself to listen all the way through. There was no distortion, no static, nothing that would indicate it had been altered. Just a simple recording, except it wasn't simple. Because whoever had sent it had recorded it down there, in the tunnels. I recognized the echo, the way sound carried in those spaces. I knew the tunnels well enough to tell the difference between a recording made in a tight service corridor and one made in a wide open passage. And this? It was recorded somewhere deep. Somewhere old. My first instinct was to delete it. But that wouldn't change what I had seen. Wouldn't change the footprints. The thing that had turned its head too far. Wouldn't erase the fact that it had followed me back. I had to go back. It felt insane. Every rational part of my mind screamed against it. But the feeling in my gut, the one that had kept me alive through years of working underground, told me that it wouldn't matter if I tried to forget. Whatever this was, it wasn't done with me. And I needed to know why. I left my apartment just before midnight, carrying a backup flashlight, my crowbar, and, just for the sake of whatever shred of logic I had left, a Geiger counter. If this was some kind of leak, if the air down there was poisoned, I wanted to know before I stepped back into it. The moment I entered the subway station, I felt the pressure again. That heavy, leaden weight pressing against my chest. Like the tunnels knew I was coming back. The service corridor leading to City Hall was empty. No late-night workers, no maintenance crews. Just the dull flicker of overhead lights casting long shadows on the tiled floor. My boots echoed as I walked, the sound swallowed up by the yawning dark beyond the old station. And then I saw them. The footprints. Still there. Exactly as I had left them the night before. Except now, there were more. Not just leading into the tunnel, but leading back out. My stomach turned. I crouched down, pressing my fingers into the dust where my boot print should have been. It crumbled beneath my touch. Fresh. Too fresh. Something had followed my steps. Copied them. I swallowed against the dryness in my throat and forced myself forward. The tunnel felt wrong tonight, the air colder, the silence heavier. My flashlight barely cut through the murk, the beam flickering at the edges. I tightened my grip on the crowbar and stepped over the rusted metal gate that lay twisted on the ground, the same gate that had been missing the night before. And there it was. The door. I knew it would be there before I even reached it, before the flashlight revealed its rusted surface, the deep, claw-like scratches running across the metal. Last night, it had been open just a crack. Now, it was wider. Just enough for someone, or something, to slip through. A stench leaked from the gap, thick and sour, the kind of decay that sticks to the back of your throat. I raised the Geiger counter, pressing my thumb against the worn button. The screen flickered, the numbers holding steady. No radiation. No interference. Which meant that whatever this was, it wasn't a gas leak. It wasn't human. A sound broke the silence. A slow, dragging noise from somewhere beyond the door. My breath caught in my chest. I knew that sound. I had heard it before. Something was moving inside. And then, just beneath it, came the whistling. Not recorded. Not distant. Right there. Right behind the door. The whistling was soft at first, barely audible over the pounding in my chest. But it was close, too close. Just beyond the rusted door, in the darkness where my flashlight couldn't reach. A slow, deliberate tune, like someone humming to themselves in an empty house. I stood frozen, my breath locked in my throat. The Geiger counter's screen dimmed in my hand, the numbers steady. No radiation. No interference. Whatever was beyond that door wasn't some gas leak or environmental hazard. It was alive. The dragging sound came again, something heavy shifting against the floor. Not footsteps. Something pulling itself forward. I stepped back, slow and careful, boots scraping against the dirt. The moment my foot moved, the whistling stopped. A long, breathless silence filled the tunnel. I held still, sweat slick on the back of my neck. My flashlight beam trembled as I aimed it at the open gap. I shouldn't have looked. I knew I shouldn't. But my body wasn't listening to my brain anymore. I leaned in. The door creaked, shifting slightly, and the smell poured out stronger, rotting meat and something chemical, sharp enough to sting my eyes. My flashlight barely touched the darkness inside, the beam swallowed by the pitch black beyond. But then, movement. A hand. No. Not a hand. Something that looked like one, but the fingers were too long, the skin too pale and stretched, like wet paper draped over bone. It twitched, fingers curling, and for a second I thought it would reach for me. But instead, it did something worse. It pressed one long finger to its lips. Shoo! My entire body seized. The pressure in my skull, the weight on my chest, it all doubled. I stumbled back, light flickering as I nearly lost my grip on the crowbar. And then, the door slammed shut. The force of it shook the tunnel, the sound crashing against the walls like a gunshot. Dust rained from the ceiling, the floor vibrating beneath me. The Geiger counter in my hand crackled, the numbers spiking for a split second before going dead. Then the tunnel was silent. I turned and ran. I didn't stop until I hit the platform, stumbling onto solid ground, my breath coming in ragged, shaking gasps. A few late-night passengers stood waiting for the train, oblivious to the fact that I had just seen something I shouldn't have. Something that shouldn't exist. My hands were still trembling when I clocked out. But I couldn't just leave it alone. Because as I reached for my phone, I saw the notification waiting for me. A new audio file. No sender. No details. Just sitting there in my messages. I pressed play. The breathing was slower this time. Closer. And then, beneath it, the same slow, deliberate whistling. Like it was right behind me. I didn't go home. I couldn't. Not after hearing that recording. I stood outside the subway entrance for nearly an hour, staring at my phone, my mind racing through every possible explanation. Maybe someone was screwing with me. Maybe there was a rational reason for all of this. But deep down, I knew. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't a mistake. Something had followed me out of that tunnel. The streets were empty, the city breathing around me and flickering neon and the distant wail of sirens. I turned my phone over in my hands, debating whether to play the recording again. I didn't want to, but I had to. I pressed play. The breathing came first. Wet. Slow. Too close. Then, the whistling. It wasn't just the same eerie tune, it was pacing itself to my breath. Slower when I exhaled, quickening when I took a sharp inhale. It was mimicking me. A new sound joined it this time. A faint scraping, rhythmic, like nails dragging against stone. I turned in a slow circle on the sidewalk, heart slamming against my ribs. No one was there. No footsteps behind me. Just the distant hum of the city, indifferent to the horror unraveling in my ears. I nearly dropped the phone when the whisper came. Don't look. I slammed the phone into my pocket, my pulse a wild thing in my throat. My body felt cold, wrong, like something was just over my shoulder, breathing against the back of my neck. I needed to go somewhere. Anywhere but home. There was only one place I could think of. The MTA maintenance hub on West 53rd Street is a relic from another time, yellowed linoleum, flickering fluorescent lights, the kind of place where bad coffee and tired men exist in equal measure. I used my access card and stepped inside, barely acknowledging the security guard before heading straight for the break room. I wasn't alone. Frank Rousseau. Mid-50s, thick Brooklyn accent, a guy who had been working the tunnels longer than I'd been alive. He was stirring cream into his coffee, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. I hesitated in the doorway. I didn't know what I was about to say. Hell, I didn't even know what I was looking for. Confirmation? An explanation? Frank looked up and frowned. You look like hell, kid. I swallowed. My throat was so dry it hurt. Frank, have you ever seen anything weird down there? He went still. just for a second. But I saw it, that flicker in his expression, something sharp and unspoken passing behind his eyes. He set his coffee down slowly. What kind of weird? I gripped the back of a chair, knuckles white. City Hall Station. The old tunnels. I found a door. Frank inhaled through his nose, long and slow. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it. You went past the gate, didn't you? The room felt smaller suddenly, the air tighter. I nodded. Frank stared at me for a long time, then exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. Jesus Christ. He sat down, gesturing for me to do the same. Listen to me, and listen good. Whatever you saw down there, whatever followed you out, his jaw tightened. You need to pretend it never happened. The chair beneath me felt unsteady. My fingers were ice cold against the cheap plastic. Frank, what is it? He hesitated. Then, after a long moment, he muttered, they used to talk about it when I started. The old guys. Not in detail, not where anyone important could hear. But there were stories. He tapped a finger against the table. Doors that weren't supposed to be there. Tunnels that weren't on any map. Places that didn't lead where they should. The room was too quiet. The air too heavy. I barely managed to ask, and? Frank leaned in. His voice dropped lower. They said, if you ever hear the whistling, his fingers curled into a fist. Don't look. Don't follow. Don't ever go back. My stomach clenched. What happens if you do? Frank just shook his head. Nobody knows. Because nobody comes back. I wanted to tell him about the recordings. About the whisper in my phone. But I didn't get the chance. Because in that exact moment, my phone buzzed. A new message. No sender. No details. Just another audio file. Frank saw the look on my face. His knuckles turned white against the table. Tell me that's not what I think it is. I couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. Because as I stared down at my screen, the title of the new recording made my blood run cold. I see you. I didn't want to press play. I didn't even want to touch my phone, but the message sat there, screen glowing in the dim break room, demanding my attention. The title alone made my stomach drop. I see you. Frank leaned in slightly, eyes locked onto the screen. Don't, he said, voice low and tight. Whatever it is, you don't need to hear it. But I did. Because if I ignored it, it wouldn't stop. It would just keep following me. My fingers trembled as I tapped the file. The first sound was breathing, slow, thick, wet. Too close. Then came the scrape, a dragging, rhythmic pull against concrete, the same noise I had heard beyond the rusted door. My stomach clenched at the familiarity of it. Something new joined the recording, footsteps. Not hesitant, not uneven. Deliberate. Even. Closer. A whisper crackled through the static, words curling like damp breath against my ear. Why did you come back? The voice was wrong, off by just enough to make my skin crawl, like something that had learned to speak but hadn't gotten it quite right. Then came the final sound, the one that nearly made me drop the phone, the whistling. It was different this time. Last night, it had been distant, an eerie melody swallowed by the tunnels. Now it was sharp. Clear. Like it was standing right behind me. The chair beneath me scraped against the floor as I pushed back, heart hammering. Frank shot up, already gripping his radio. What the hell did you just hear? I tried to answer, but the words stuck in my throat. When I finally forced them out, my voice felt thin, strangled. It was inside. Frank's face paled. Inside where? I turned my phone toward him, my hands clammy, my breath uneven. The recording had a timestamp. It had been recorded 3 minutes ago. Before either of us could react, his radio crackled to life. Dispatch to Russo, got a report of a security breach at West 53rd, someone saw movement near the restricted tunnels, sending a unit to check it out. Frank's expression darkened. The room felt smaller, the air thicker. West 53rd. This station. The realization hit both of us at the same time. The recording wasn't from inside the tunnels. It was from inside the station. And it wasn't old. It was happening right now. A sound drifted in from the hallway. A whistle. Long, slow. Right outside the break room door. Frank grabbed my wrist in a crushing grip and pulled me toward the emergency exit. We're leaving. Now. The hallway lights flickered, casting jagged shadows across the walls. The whistling didn't stop. It didn't change. It was waiting. Frank yanked open the stairwell door, and we bolted up the steps 2 at a time. My breath came in sharp, panicked gasps, the stale air pressing against my back. I fumbled for my radio, my fingers numb as I forced my voice to stay steady. Dispatch, this is Darren from maintenance, security breach is real. We need backup. Now. The radio answered with static. Frank didn't stop moving. He threw open the door at the top of the stairs, dragging me onto the sidewalk outside the station. The second we crossed the threshold, the pressure lifted. The air was normal again. My ears popped. The world snapped back into focus. I turned, fully expecting to see something behind us, something standing in the glow of the subway entrance. But there was nothing. No shadow. No sound. Just an empty street, indifferent to the nightmare unfolding beneath it. I checked my phone again. The file was gone. Like it had never existed. Frank wiped his mouth, his hands visibly shaking. He turned to me, his expression dark and final. You're done. I swallowed, my throat dry. What? You're not going back down there. His fingers curled into a fist. I'll talk to the supervisors, I'll make something up if I have to, but you're off the tunnels. His words should have been a relief, but all I felt was a deep, suffocating weight settling in my chest. We both knew the truth. This wasn't over. It wouldn't matter if I stopped working the tunnels. It wouldn't matter if I quit, if I left the city, if I never stepped underground again. Because whatever was down there, whatever had seen me, followed me, whispered to me. It wasn't finished with me yet. I didn't sleep. I didn't even try. I sat in my apartment with every light on, my back pressed against the wall, watching the front door as if it might move on its own. Every creak in the hallway made my pulse jump, every shifting shadow twisted my stomach. The file had disappeared from my phone, but that didn't mean anything. It was still with me. Frank had made himself clear, I was done. I wasn't supposed to go back underground, wasn't supposed to talk about it, wasn't even supposed to think about it anymore. But it wasn't that simple. I had spent years working in those tunnels, years memorizing their every turn, every maintenance hatch, every dead-end corridor that the city had forgotten. And yet, I had missed something. A space that shouldn't exist. A door that had never been there before. Somewhere around 3 a.m., my phone buzzed. I grabbed it without thinking, a cold shiver racing up my spine as I stared at the notification. Another message. No number. No sender. Just one word. Tonight. My fingers clenched around the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. The buzzing in my ears wasn't from the device, it was my own heartbeat, hammering against my skull. I already knew what it meant. I wasn't done. And it was coming. By morning, I had made a decision. If this thing wanted me to go back, I'd go back. But not alone. I waited outside the MTA maintenance hub, leaning against my car, barely tasting the coffee in my hand. The moment I saw Frank step outside, I pushed off the door and intercepted him before he could disappear down the block. I need to talk to you, I said, my voice rough from lack of sleep. Frank sighed, rubbing his eyes like he already regretted stopping. Kid, we talked about this. You need to let it go. I shook my head. I got another message. Last night. His whole body tensed, his expression darkening in a way I hadn't seen before. What did it say? One word, I swallowed. Tonight. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. He just stood there, jaw tight, like he was debating whether to walk away. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the alley behind the hub. There's an old rule, he muttered. Something they don't write down. The kind of thing you only hear about if you've been working the tunnels long enough. He glanced around, lowering his voice. Sometimes, people disappear. Not accidents. Not collapses. Just gone. And the ones who come back. He hesitated, his face grim. They don't come back, right? A cold knot formed in my stomach. What do you mean? They're wrong. They look the same. Talk the same. But they aren't. And the worst part? His eyes locked onto mine, his voice barely above a whisper. No one notices. Except the ones who listen. The words sat between us, heavy and suffocating. My skin prickled. You're saying it's not just following me? Frank inhaled sharply, then exhaled through his nose. I'm saying it's looking for something. Or someone. I wanted to press him for more. Wanted to force him to tell me everything. But before I could, he took a step back, hands raised. This is the last time I'm talking about this. Whatever happens tonight, I don't want to know. Then he turned and walked away, his posture stiff, like if he moved too fast something might notice. I stood in the alley long after he was gone. I had my answer. Tonight, I was going back. The tunnels felt different the moment I stepped onto the old City Hall platform. I had been walking these paths for years, but now, something had shifted. The air was wrong, thicker, heavier, damp with a rotting, stagnant weight. The maintenance lights flickered overhead, casting jagged shadows along the walls. Every sound felt sharper, more alive. Even the echo of my own footsteps bounced back at me in a way that didn't make sense. I adjusted my grip on the crowbar, my breath steady as I moved toward the service tunnel. The footprints were back. Only this time, there were more. Not just mine. Not just the single set I had followed before. Now there were several, scattered in overlapping patterns, some newer, some much older. They were all barefoot, all heading toward the same place. The rusted door was open. Wider than before. The smell hit me instantly, thick and wet, something decayed, something old, something waiting. My pulse pounded in my ears as I stepped forward, flashlight barely penetrating the blackness beyond the door. The air was dead inside, no sound, no movement. But I knew it was there. Watching. A low, deliberate whistle drifted from the darkness. I inhaled slowly, keeping my grip tight, forcing myself not to turn and run. Something moved beyond the threshold. Not a shadow. Not a trick of the light. Something real. And then it turned to look at me. At first, my brain refused to process what I was seeing. The proportions were right. The face, the stance, the way the light just barely caught the shape of a human form. But then, the eyes. Too wide. Too black. Too empty. It was my face. Grinning back at me from the dark. And then, I whistled. The sound of my own whistling, but not mine, echoed in the tunnel. It carried through the still air, each note twisting and curling in ways that made my skin crawl. My legs locked, my breath shallow, every instinct in me screaming to turn and run. But I couldn't. The thing that wore my face didn't move. It just stood there, staring from the open doorway, its grin too wide, too stiff, like the muscles weren't meant to work that way. The eyes, black, endless, hollow, didn't blink. I swallowed hard, gripping the crowbar until my fingers ached. My own flashlight barely touched the darkness behind it, like the space beyond the door refused to be lit. The tunnel smelled like rot, old water, and something else, something chemical, sharp enough to sting my throat. It tilted its head, slow and unnatural, its neck bending at a sharp angle, too far, like there was no bone beneath the skin. And then, still grinning, still holding my gaze, It stepped forward. The movement shattered whatever was keeping me frozen. I stumbled back, my boots scraping against the damp tile floor. My pulse was hammering, every muscle in my body coiled, waiting for it to lunge. But it didn't. It just kept coming. Not fast, not slow. A steady, measured pace. Each step deliberate, light, as if it were trying not to make a sound. I took another step back. My breath hitched in my throat, my vision narrowing. The tunnel behind me stretched long and empty, but I couldn't turn my back to it. I couldn't let it out of my sight. Then it spoke. Not in words. Not in a whisper. It copied me. The exact way I had breathed a moment ago, the same shallow inhales, the same uneven exhale, like it had memorized my panic and was playing it back to me. My chest seized. I tried to speak, but my voice caught. Then it moved again. Faster. Not running, not charging. Just short, jerky steps, like it was fighting against something, like it was trying to hold itself back. No. No, no, no. I tightened my grip on the crowbar and swung. The metal hit solid, but there was no resistance, like hitting a sack of air. The impact should have knocked it back, should have broken something. But it only staggered slightly, as if adjusting. And then, it laughed. Not a real laugh. My laugh. It was the same breathless chuckle I had given Frank earlier that morning. The same tone, pitch, hesitation. It was like hearing a recording of myself, played back from some broken, twisted speaker. I ran. I don't remember making the decision. 1 second I was standing there, the next my body had taken over, my feet slamming against the tunnel floor as I sprinted toward the platform. The sound of my own laughter followed me, bouncing off the walls. I reached the main tunnel and veered left, heading straight for the emergency exit hatch. My hands fumbled with the latch, my breath ragged. The metal creaked as I yanked it open, my boots skidding on the damp floor as I pulled myself up onto the catwalk, my muscles burning with effort. I turned, just for a second. The tunnel was empty. No figure. No laughter. No movement. I slammed the hatch shut and didn't stop running. I don't remember getting home. 1 second I was underground, the next I was stumbling into my apartment, locking the door, pushing furniture against it like that would do anything. My lungs ached, my hands still locked in fists, my nails pressing into my palms so hard I thought they might break skin. I had made it out. But it didn't feel like I had escaped. My phone buzzed. I jumped, my back pressing against the wall. The sound made my skin crawl. My hand shook as I reached for it, my breath coming too fast. A new message. No sender. No subject. Just an audio file. I knew better. I knew I shouldn't play it. But my fingers moved before I could stop them. The recording started with breathing. Then the whistling. Then, clear as day, my own voice. I see you. I threw the phone. It hit the wall with a dull thud and slid to the floor, the screen still glowing. My chest heaved, my pulse hammered against my skull, and the static in my ears drowned out everything else. I wanted to smash it, to destroy it, but I knew it wouldn't matter. The message would still be there. The thing behind it would still be waiting. The apartment felt smaller, like the walls had drawn closer when I wasn't looking. The air thickened, pressing against my skin, and the worst part, the part one didn't want to acknowledge, was the way my own breath sounded in my ears. Shaky. Uneven. Exactly like the recording. I forced myself to think. Doors locked. Windows shut. Lights on. None of it mattered. I had seen what it could do. It didn't need an open door. It didn't need an invitation. It had already followed me home. I reached for my phone with a shaking hand, staring at the message again. The timestamp was fresh. The file sat there like an open wound, waiting to be touched, waiting for me to listen again. My stomach twisted as I clenched my teeth and did something I should have done from the start. I called Frank. The phone rang once before he picked up. His voice was a low rasp, rougher than I had ever heard it. Jesus Christ, kid, what did you do? I hesitated, my throat dry, my tongue heavy. I went back, I muttered, barely recognizing my own voice. A heavy silence stretched between us. Frank inhaled sharply. You saw it, didn't you? I squeezed my eyes shut, gripping the phone tighter. It looked like me. A string of curses hissed through the receiver. I heard movement on his end, pacing, a chair scraping against the floor, like he was somewhere he wasn't supposed to be. His voice dropped lower, barely above a whisper. Listen to me. Do not answer the door. Do not look at anything reflective. If you hear it in your apartment, do not move. Do you understand? A sharp knock echoed through my apartment. My breath stopped. It wasn't loud. Just 3 slow taps against the wood. I barely found my voice. Frank, my chest tightened, every muscle in my body locking up. Someone's here. Frank's voice sharpened. Don't open it. Another knock. 3 slow taps. Not demanding, not violent. Just waiting. A voice followed, smooth and familiar. Hey. It's me. The blood in my veins turned to ice. My own voice was coming from the other side of the door. Frank's breathing went sharp. Do not answer it. Do not speak. If you acknowledge it, you're done. Another knock. Come on, man. The tone was casual, too normal, like I was listening to an old voicemail I didn't remember recording. I need you to let me in. I pressed my back against the farthest wall, gripping the phone so hard my fingers ached. My body knew before my brain did, if I moved toward the door, I wouldn't be the one walking away. The thing outside my apartment sighed. I know you're scared, it said, voice steady, patient. I would be too. But you don't have to be. It's fine now. I took care of it. The air in the room shifted, dense and suffocating, like the walls were pressing closer. Open the door, man, the voice continued. You're safe now. I promise. A soft whistle drifted from the hallway. Frank's breath hitched. Don't listen. Something in my vision blurred, like static in the corner of my eyes. The sound, my own voice, curled around my ribs, pressing into my thoughts, pulling at something deep inside me. You don't have to fight anymore, it whispered. I can do this for you. I can be you. My fingers twitched toward the doorknob. And for one horrifying second, I almost let it in. Frank's voice snapped me out of it. Go to the mirror. Now. My legs barely moved, my limbs stiff, sluggish. Every step felt like walking through wet cement. My own breath sounded foreign in my ears as I staggered toward the bathroom. The moment I stepped inside, my stomach plummeted. My reflection was wrong. The shape was mine. The features were mine. But the eyes weren't there. Just 2 black hollows, deep, endless, waiting. It smiled. Not a normal smile. Not human. The corners of the mouth stretched too wide, the skin pulling in ways it wasn't supposed to. Frank's voice was a growl in my ear. Break it. Now. I grabbed the nearest thing I could, a glass from the sink, and hurled it at the mirror. The moment the glass shattered, the apartment screamed. The walls groaned like something was being peeled away, and the lights flickered violently, stuttering between reality and something else. A sound erupted from the hallway, a scream, but not human. It was a wet, garbled distortion, something caught between laughter and pain, a sound that shouldn't exist. Then, silence. I stood there, chest heaving, staring at the fractured reflection, the shards on the floor glinting like teeth. The air in the apartment felt lighter, thinner, like whatever had pressed against it was finally gone. The knock at the door never came back. Frank's voice was steady, but strained. It's not over. But you stopped it for now. My breath came fast and shallow. For now? A long pause. Then, a sigh. They always come back. The call cut out. I stared at my phone, the silence stretching long and empty. I knew he was right. This wasn't over. It would come back. And next time, it wouldn't wait for an invitation. The mirror remained shattered, jagged pieces scattered across the bathroom tiles like the remnants of something long dead. My reflection, or what had been pretending to be my reflection, was gone. But the weight in my chest told me the truth, this wasn't over. The air in my apartment had lightened, but it hadn't gone back to normal. It felt like something had been here and had only just left, hovering just beyond the edges of my perception, watching, waiting. I didn't sleep. I didn't even try. I sat in my living room with my back against the wall, every light on, my eyes never straying from the front door. My phone remained in my lap, my fingers wrapped around it, half expecting another message to appear at any moment. Hours passed, stretching into dawn, and still, nothing came. But I knew better than to believe it was over. I spent the next few days moving like a ghost, unable to shake the feeling that I was being followed. The air around me felt wrong, my own shadow feeling heavier than it should, lingering too long while I turned a corner. I caught glimpses of my reflection in store windows, car mirrors, polished metal, and every time, a cold sweat would break out down my spine as I forced myself to look away before I could be sure if it was really me looking back. I kept my phone off, ignoring the world, refusing to check my messages. If it wanted to reach me, I wasn't going to make it easy. But none of that mattered. Because 4 nights later, I woke up to the sound of my own voice. Not a dream. Not a memory. A whisper. Right next to my ear. Let me in. I bolted upright, my pulse slamming against my ribs. The room was empty, but the air was suffocating, thick with something unseen pressing on all sides. My phone, which I knew for a fact had been powered off, buzzed on the nightstand. I didn't want to look. I knew what it would be. But my body moved before my mind could stop it. No sender. No details. Just another message. I forced myself to open it. It wasn't a text. It was a video. With shaking fingers, I tapped the screen. The footage was grainy, distorted by static. At first, I thought the screen was just dark, nothing but shifting pixels. But then the image sharpened. It was my apartment door. My stomach dropped as I watched the footage flicker. A figure stood in front of the door, barely visible in the dim hallway light. It was me. Not similar. Me. Same clothes. Same posture. Same stillness. The screen flickered again, distorting as the figure tilted its head, just slightly, as if listening. Then, without moving its lips, my own voice came through the speakers. I know you're in there. The figure raised a hand. Knocked 3 times. Then, slowly, the door handle began to turn. The video cut out. I threw the phone across the room. My entire body was trembling, a cold sweat soaking my back. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. It had been here. It had recorded itself standing at my door. A new sound filled the silence, low, distant, whistling. I scrambled back against the wall, my hands shaking. The sound wasn't coming from inside my apartment. It was coming from the hallway. Frank's words echoed in my head, warnings that I had ignored, things I had refused to understand. It's trying to replace you. It wasn't just stalking me. It wasn't just following me. It was waiting for me to break. I couldn't let it win. I had 2 choices, stay inside and wait for it to try again, or face it. I grabbed my crowbar and my flashlight, heart hammering against my ribs. This had started underground. That's where it had to end. The subway tunnels felt different this time. They had always been unsettling at night, empty and endless, but now they felt alive. The air vibrated with something beneath the surface, something just beyond my ability to comprehend. I moved quickly, keeping my breath steady, my grip tight around the crowbar. The moment I stepped onto the abandoned City Hall platform, the atmosphere shifted. The tunnel felt heavier, like something was aware of my presence. The door was waiting for me. It stood open now, gaping wide, revealing a tunnel that shouldn't exist. My flashlight barely cut through the blackness inside. The smell was the same, rotting, damp, suffocating. But this time, I wasn't running. This time, I stepped inside. The walls were wrong. They weren't stone, weren't metal. The texture rippled like something alive, shifting under the beam of my light. I moved carefully, one step at a time, the silence pressing down on my skull. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Not mine. Ahead of me, deeper in the tunnel. I rounded a corner and froze. It was there. Standing motionless in the dark, waiting for me. It wore my face. My skin. My clothes. But the eyes, those black, endless pits, weren't mine. It smiled, a slow, unnatural grin stretching too wide. Then, it lifted one hand and beckoned me forward. "You don't have to fight anymore," it said in my voice. "I can take your place. You don't even have to feel it. Just let go." My fingers clenched around the crowbar. "You're not me." It tilted its head, like it was considering something. Then it stepped forward. I swung. The metal connected with solid flesh, sending it staggering. But it didn't fall. It didn't break. It just laughed. A broken, rattling, distorted mockery of my own voice. Then it lunged. I don't remember the fight. I remember the weight of it pressing down on me, the sensation of cold fingers clawing at my skin, the sheer, incomprehensible wrongness of touching something that looked human but wasn't. I remember my flashlight flickering, the tunnel walls twisting, bending, folding in on themselves. And then, the door slammed shut. I gasped for air, collapsing onto the tunnel floor. The smell was gone. The weight in the air had lifted. When I turned, the door was sealed. No seams. No rusted frame. Like it had never existed. The tunnel was silent. I stumbled to my feet, my legs weak, my breath shaky. I had one. But as I walked back toward the platform, my own footsteps echoing in the emptiness, I realized something that made my blood run cold. There was another set of footsteps behind me. Perfectly in sync. Matching me exactly. I kept walking. I didn't look back.